Good evening. If you've ever stared into your fridge wondering how to stretch half a carrot and 2 eggs into dinner, you may find you have more in common with a medieval peasant than you'd like to admit. Welcome to History Before Sleep, where we take a slow, quiet walk through the lives of people who've long since gone to sleep themselves. If you're listening in bed with tired eyes and an overthinking brain, this is for you. If you enjoy these gentle stories, and you'd like to drift off to more strange, slow tales of the past, just tap the like button, and subscribe to the channel. That way, you'll always have a soft place to land at the end of your day. Now, in the year 1347, across the muddy villages of England, winter had a way of exposing just how thin the line was between surviving and not. Back then, there were no pantries, no canned beans, no grocery runs. If you ran out of food, that was the end of the story, unless you had something far more valuable than gold: community, cleverness, and the quiet grit of knowing how to make nothing last just one more day. And today, we're going to walk you through how that was done. How a woman, let's say one of thousands like her, kept 5 children fed with half a turnip and a bone boiled so many times it could file for retirement. This is not a heroic tale. There are no triumphs. Only pots of hot water, dried peas with names, and gossip that saved lives. Welcome to your crash course in medieval meal planning. Let's begin. By late February, the medieval kitchen of a peasant family had entered its season of silence. Gone were the onions that once hung from the rafters in neat braids, now soft, sprouting, or simply vanished. The cured meats, if there had been any, were a memory shared more in smell than substance. The larder, once full of hopeful autumn storage, had been reduced to a few unpromising survivors: a sagging turnip, some brittle peas, and a small cloth bag of oats so thin and dusty it felt more symbolic than useful. In a world without grocery stores, seasons dictated survival. Autumn gave. Winter took. Spring teased. People didn't eat the way we do now: 3 meals a day, snacks in between, the occasional luxury of ordering dinner from a glowing screen. No, eating in 1347 was a slow, deliberate act of negotiation with time, weather, and fate. It meant knowing exactly how much grain you had left by heart, and being able to stretch that number like a skilled juggler with only one ball. By February, even hope had to be rationed. The fire in the hearth still burned, but just barely, fed by twigs, damp moss, and whatever could be pried from the forest floor. It boiled a pot of water into which everything and nothing was added. Soup, they called it. But it was really more of a ceremony: the placing of a single pea, a scrape of oat, a bone boiled for the 5th, or was it the 6th time? That bone had become more than food. It was a relic. Revered. Reused. Regretted. No flour. No salt. No oil. Certainly no honey. Unless, of course, someone nearby kept bees and owed them a very serious favor. What few oats remained clung to the cloth bag like old men at a tavern, past their prime but stubbornly present. The turnip had shriveled into something that looked vaguely resentful, as if disappointed to still be here. And yet, every morning, a meal was made. Not because there was enough, there wasn't, but because the children needed something warm in their bellies. Because hunger doesn't wait for a better harvest. The children ate first. They always did. Not out of nobility, but practicality. They had smaller stomachs and louder protests. The husband, if home, got the next share, slurped down between roofing work, firewood hauling, or chasing rumors of paid labor. And finally, the woman herself, scraping the bottom of the pot for something that could still be called food. You might think your fridge is empty when there's only almond milk and some wilting parsley. But in 1347, the concept of snacks didn't exist. Neither did plates for everyone at the table. Dinner was what could be ladled. Seconds were for dreamers. And still, they managed. Not with recipes or meal plans, but with memory, muscle, and a little quiet magic. The kind of kitchen sorcery modern cookbooks don't teach: boiling bones for broth, using turnip greens as seasoning, feeding 1 egg to 5 people without anyone noticing. Even hunger was part of the routine. It came, it sat with them, it left. And tomorrow, it would come again. In a time when survival meant cunning, community, and a certain resigned creativity, feeding a family was less about preparing a meal and more about stretching the definition of food entirely. The kitchen, if you could even call it that, was a corner of the cottage with a soot-stained hearth, an iron pot, and hope. A pot that rarely left the fire, not because meals were plentiful, but because boiling the same scraps over and over was a strategy in itself. Broth was a way of life. The bone, just the one, had long since given up any meaningful contribution to flavor, but it was still boiled daily, out of habit and perhaps superstition. Every morning it went back in the pot with a handful of oats or dried nettles, as if its spirit might rally and offer up one last whisper of nourishment. The result was a grayish liquid with the consistency of memory. But it was hot, and it filled the belly. Meals were often more ritual than sustenance. The eldest child might get the slightly thicker scoop, the baby might be given a pinch of crushed peas softened in water, and the rest filled in the gaps with bread that could chip a tooth. If you were lucky, you still had some bread, that is. Most often, it was last season's rye, dried hard enough to serve as a roofing tile. Soaked in broth, it became edible. Mostly. And then there were eggs. Or rather, the occasional egg. A single egg, when it graced the household, was treated with a reverence usually reserved for relics. It could be beaten into a stew to thicken it, or shared with surgical precision, the yolk for the youngest, the whites thinned with water and spooned into bowls. Some women swore by adding ground barley to make it stretch further. Some added stale beer. All agreed that complaining about it only made things worse. Flour was rarer than kindness in February. If you had any left, it was from the autumn grind, stored in a wooden box and guarded like treasure. With no flour came no real bread, and certainly no pastries, not that most peasants had ever tasted a pastry. Honey? A rumor. Salt? A memory. So women, because it was mostly women who bore this burden, got creative. Leftover cabbage leaves were dried and reboiled. Mice, if caught, were skinned and stewed. And no one ever talked about the hedgehog incident. Some foraged, even in winter, bark, moss, wild roots if the ground wasn't too frozen. Sometimes that paid off. Sometimes it led to an evening of vomiting and regrets. These were the quiet strategies. The daily, often invisible labor of keeping a family alive without anyone realizing how close to the edge they truly were. There was no applause for making broth from nothing, no medals for turning 3 shriveled turnips into 4 meals. But there should have been. Especially when, just a few hundred years later, someone standing in front of a modern fridge will sigh, close it again, and announce they have nothing to eat. It's almost poetic, really. I know you might be feeling a little horrified that I even mentioned the idea of a mouse becoming a meal. Understandable. But let me explain, because it wasn't just a matter of desperation. It was a matter of adaptation. What we'd call pests today, rats, mice, squirrels, even sparrows, could sometimes be dinner if prepared right and seasoned with the right herbs, assuming you had herbs. Or salt. Or any seasoning at all. And even then, most of the flavor was probably just hunger. But here's the thing, this wasn't a last resort every time. Medieval folks didn't expect a roast with sides and dessert. They didn't have the mental image of a balanced plate. They worked with what the land gave, or what the neighbor might trade. The truly strange part is how normal this all was. These weren't emergency survival meals, they were just meals. Now, maybe you're thinking, why not just rely on eggs? Chickens lay eggs, right? They had chickens, surely? Excellent question. But here's the inconvenient truth, chickens didn't lay eggs year-round. Not in the Middle Ages. Especially not in winter. Chickens are sun-sensitive creatures, and winter's dim gray light meant fewer eggs. Also, most peasants didn't keep flocks of chickens the way we might imagine. A few hens, maybe, if they could protect them from foxes, hawks, and the occasional hungry neighbor with a grudge. And even then, those precious eggs were often considered too valuable to eat. Better to trade an egg than scramble it. And that brings us to the real genius of medieval survival: barter. In a world where coins were rare and wages were mostly theoretical, barter was the engine of life, and the social glue of entire villages. Women especially were the masters of this quiet economy. Not just because they managed the household resources, but because they knew how to talk. They knew whose child had the sniffles, whose husband was drinking too much, and whose turnip cellar had started to smell suspiciously like onions. A scrap of wool, a mended hem, half a bundle of kindling, these could all be traded for a few spoonfuls of dried beans, a pinch of salt, or a slice of stale rye. A favor today for a favor next week. Or better yet, a juicy bit of gossip in exchange for a crust of bread. You'd be amazed what a story could buy if told in the right tone, with the right raised eyebrow. And make no mistake, gossip was currency. Not the petty, backstabbing kind, but the essential, community-sustaining kind. Who had cheese tucked away, who got a package from their cousin near the abbey, who was seen carrying a basket that was too full to be casual. Women tracked these details like ledger entries. It wasn't just chatter, it was strategy. Modern group chats have nothing on a 14th century breadline. And remember, all of this was done while stirring the soup, watching the fire, nursing the baby, and picking head lice from a toddler's hair. These women weren't just multitasking. They were managing microeconomies while pretending it was all just friendly conversation. If today's momfluencers think they invented hustle, they may want to have a word with Agnes and her neighbors. If you're picturing grand medieval markets filled with colorful spices, cheerful bartering, and the smell of freshly baked bread, no. Not here. Not in February. Not in a peasant village where even the rats are considering relocation. This is where survival becomes an art, and the women, the unsung economists of the era, start to shine. Barter wasn't a cheerful pastime. It was closer to a slow-moving negotiation with desperation lurking under every polite smile. Your flax scraps might get you an onion. A length of spun wool? Maybe a heel of bread. And if you were really lucky, if someone in your cousin's husband's cousin's household had a goat that recently gave birth, you might trade 2 evenings of mending for a spoonful of milk. Forget currency. This was an economy of need, patched together by threadbare kindness and well-timed favors. And gossip? Oh, gossip was not idle chatter. It was the lifeline. The medieval version of Google, TikTok, and your local mom group, all rolled into one. If someone's uncle had hidden away a jar of goose fat, someone else knew. If a wife was baking and her chimney smelled of actual flour, the news spread faster than any church sermon. Women traded these morsels of intel like holy relics. I heard Marta's boy saw a wheel of cheese in their shed. That single sentence could alter a day's strategy. And of course, favors were always accruing quiet interest. I'll darn your husband's socks if you let me scrape your stew pot after supper. You can borrow our pan, but you'll owe me 2 mornings of water hauling. It wasn't transactional in a cold way, it was warm, tired, resilient. Women remembered everything, who shared, who hoarded, whose turn it was. They kept track not on parchment, but in glances, nods, and a carefully tilted eyebrow across the yard. Their memories were the balance sheet of the village. Their reputations, their credit scores. And where were the men? Well, the men came and went. They swung hammers, dug ditches, mumbled about taxes, and sometimes brought home a fish, or a splinter. But when it came to keeping the fire lit and the pot full, it was usually a woman at the center of the web, spinning strategies out of gossip and grit. Now, not every neighbor was generous. And not every village was kind. But in the bitter weeks when frost clung to windows and the stew pot offered more echo than sustenance, something tender tended to take root among the women, a quiet, worn sort of solidarity. A shared understanding between those who'd all stared into the same empty cupboards and calculated the same impossible math, how to divide not enough into just enough. Help didn't come with fanfare. There were no speeches, no golden-hearted benefactors galloping in from the manor. No, help arrived in quieter forms, a hunk of dry bread left near the door. A handful of turnip peelings tucked into a child's coat pocket. A shared fire when yours went cold. It was the kind of help that didn't need explaining. Women recognized hunger in the set of another woman's shoulders, in the way she lingered by the well as if deciding whether to ask. They helped because they knew, not just what it was to go without, but what it felt like to pretend you weren't. The church occasionally helped, too, emphasis on the quotation marks. Sometimes bread fell off the back of a cart, which was curiously frequent during Lent. Or a sack of barley mysteriously made its way to the poorest hut, as long as that hut had a child baptized last week or someone who swept the church floor without being asked. But it wasn't charity that kept bellies barely full, it was network. Not the internet kind. The literal kind, woven by calloused hands and decades of favors. It was women who remembered whose child was sick last year and whose goat died in the frost. It was women who asked, without asking, "Are you all right?" meaning, "Do you have enough?" and who replied, "We're managing," meaning, "Please, if you have a crust to spare." If modern systems crumble under pressure, medieval ones bent like willow branches. Resilient. Flexible. Built not on abundance, but on mutual endurance. So, when someone found a half-rotted cabbage in a forgotten root cellar and boiled it into a pale green soup, they shared it, because they knew the person they handed it to would, someday, hand something back. That was survival. That was a community. That was love, without the luxury of calling it love. In many peasant households, there is a man. Somewhere. He isn't missing, exactly, not in the way a tragedy might frame it, but he isn't usually home either. And that's not uncommon. In a winter like this, in a year like 1347, it wasn't strange for the husband to be gone for days, or even weeks, at a time. He might be working for bread on another man's land, mending a fence, hauling logs, or standing silently in the corner of a manor kitchen waiting for whatever scraps might be tossed his way. There was no regular wage, no employer to count on, and no guarantee he'd return with anything in his hands. What he does bring back is often modest, sometimes a sack of barley, sometimes just news. He'll speak of things he's heard, that there was a fire in the neighboring village, that someone's wife died in childbirth, that the roads are too flooded to reach the mill. He might even bring back word of prices rising again. More often, it's a name, someone who's fallen ill, or someone who's had another mouth to feed. But inside the house, where the pots need stirring and the children need feeding, his absence is simply a given. The rhythm of peasant life, for many women, was built on doing everything while waiting for someone who may or may not arrive before nightfall. There is no resentment in it, not because she's a saint, but because survival doesn't leave much room for complaint. He works, she works. He leaves, she manages. It is not romance. It is not resentment. It is rhythm. And perhaps that's the clearest way to put it. Men moved through the world. Women made the world hold together while they did. If you were to pass by the cottage and glance in through the frost-laced window, you might see a woman by the hearth, stirring something, humming something, maybe wiping a child's nose with the corner of her sleeve. Nothing about the scene would seem extraordinary. Just a quiet, domestic picture of winter life. But what you wouldn't see, what no one ever really sees, is the enormous weight of planning, worrying, and pretending that keeps the whole household running. This woman, like so many others, does more than cook. She counts every dried pea before she adds it to the pot. She watches how fast the sack of oats shrinks. She remembers how many meals she can stretch from the last turnip, how many days the bone has already been boiled. She knows, by heart, what is left, not because she checked a list, but because the inventory lives in her mind, unrelenting, always ticking. She feeds the children first. Always. She tells them stories while they eat, something to distract from the thinness of the broth. She smiles when the bread crumbles. She adds wild herbs, not for flavor, but for the faint illusion of variety. She calls the plain food monk's stew or soldier's supper, and the children laugh, as if it's a game. And when they sleep, she sits in silence by the fire. Not to rest, but to think. To recalculate. To figure out how to turn what's left into something that looks like a meal, at least one more time. Sometimes, what she cooks isn't really food at all. Old husks, a handful of chaff, the fifth boiling of a marrowless bone. But she serves it with the same tenderness she would a feast, and she does it so convincingly that the children don't know the difference. There are no medals for this. No songs. Just the quiet strength of a woman who pretends everything is fine. Because that, too, is part of feeding a family. Now, if you're picturing this and thinking, well, thank goodness life isn't like that anymore, you're not entirely wrong. Most of us aren't boiling weeds for dinner or trading suck mending for onion peels. But let's not get too smug. Because somewhere out there, maybe even in your own home, there's someone opening a fridge and doing mental algebra with a stick of butter, half a bag of rice, and 2 children who don't like lentils. Someone quietly scraping through the week before payday, stretching food, emotions, and patience, and never calling it heroic. Food insecurity doesn't always look medieval. Sometimes it wears yoga pants, packs lunchboxes, and doesn't complain, because there's no time to. The mothers of 1347 weren't different in kind. They were different in resources. The emotional labor? The quiet sacrifice? The way they fed others first and made hunger look like routine? That hasn't changed nearly as much as we'd like to believe. And we still don't call it bravery. We praise battlefield courage, public speeches, and dramatic sacrifice, but we overlook the woman who gave away her last bit of broth so her child could sleep with something in their stomach. We forget that resilience doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hums while it stirs the pot, barefoot, calculating exactly how much oats it takes to make something taste like dinner. In 1347, these women weren't writing journals or leading revolts. They were surviving, and helping others survive, through invisible acts of genius and grace. And even now, we rarely tell their stories. We don't know their names. But we feel their echoes. In every mother who says I'm not hungry so her kids can have seconds. In every grandmother who can turn leftovers into a feast with nothing but salt and memory. In every woman who quietly absorbs the fear of running out, and keeps the household running anyway. So when we talk about history, let's not forget that survival isn't just a biological act. It's emotional. It's strategic. It's deeply human. And it's often invisible. When we say that medieval peasants ate whatever they could find, we're not being dramatic. If it was technically organic matter and it didn't immediately kill the last person who tried it, it went into the pot. The rule was simple. Food was what didn't fight back or poison you too quickly. In the depths of winter, when even the bones had been boiled down until they dissolved into the water, people turned to whatever was left in the yard, the woods, or even the walls. Tree bark, boiled, scraped, and mashed. Moss scraped from stones. Grasses and weeds that may or may not cause digestive issues. Even leather, from boots, belts, or bags, was soaked, scraped, and boiled into a kind of gelatinous something. If it once came from an animal, it could be reborn as stew. There are recorded cases of people boiling straw, grinding acorns into flour, despite the bitterness, or roasting rats and mice when desperate. Yes, it happened. No, it wasn't a regular delicacy. But when the cupboard holds nothing and your children are watching, the threshold for edible changes dramatically. And let's not forget the miraculous, sometimes dangerous, sometimes helpful mushrooms. If you found a patch and didn't die after eating them, congratulations, you just unlocked another food group. The point isn't to discuss the modern listener, but to recalibrate what nothing to eat really meant. Peasant life was governed by cycles, of labor, weather, and food. A full stomach in October did not mean a full stomach in March. The year moved like this: spring was lean, summer was work, autumn was bounty, and winter was endurance. In the summer and early fall, food could feel abundant. Grains were milled, root vegetables were dug up, and herbs were dried. If you were lucky, you'd salt some meat, press apples into cider, or pickle the last of the cabbages. But the bounty never lasted as long as you'd hoped. No matter how carefully you rationed, winter always outlasted your pantry. Then came Lent, 40 days of fasting in the name of God, conveniently aligned with the time when you had no butter, no eggs, and little more than gruel to work with. Peasant families didn't fast because of devotion. They fasted because there was nothing left to eat. The church just gave it a name and a schedule. So, the food calendar was not a reliable cycle of meals. It was a loop of anxiety, adaptation, and hope that next year might bring a slightly better yield. Hope was always on the menu, because second helpings rarely were. You might be wondering, if peasants had chickens, why weren't eggs a staple? Well, the idea of a cozy little chicken coop behind every cottage is comforting, but not quite true to life in the harsher parts of 1347. Chickens did exist, certainly. But they were finicky, fragile creatures who didn't lay reliably, especially in winter. No artificial light. No grain feed. If the winter was cruel, many chickens would die. Or, more accurately, many chickens were eaten. The moment an animal stopped producing and started costing effort to feed, its fate was sealed. Peasants had to make brutal calculations. Do I keep feeding this hen in hopes of an egg in March? Or do we have soup tonight? You can guess how that often played out. Even when chickens did survive, they hid their eggs. They roamed. Predators took them. The idea of gathering half a dozen fresh eggs every morning belongs more to cozy farmcore fantasy than medieval life. So no, eggs were not a dependable source of nutrition. They were a stroke of luck, a surprise ingredient, or a luxury to be hoarded for special occasions, like Saint Days, or if someone in the house was dying. While men were off bartering labor, chasing seasonal work, or pretending they were doing something useful in another hamlet, women were holding the village together with thread made from memory, favors, and sheer will. There wasn't a spreadsheet, obviously. But every woman in the village seemed to know who had what, who owed what, and who had recently come into an inheritance of onions. It was a silent, intuitive web, built over years of shared births, funerals, gossip, and necessity. She gave me a carrot last winter when my child was ill. I'll bring her broth today. Her son mended my roof. I'll dry her herbs next season. This wasn't charity, it was strategy. Reputations were currency. You didn't want to be the woman who never helped. Not just for moral reasons, but because the next time your stores were low, your door might remain closed. And this network didn't announce itself. There were no medals, no thanks, and certainly no pay. But without it, the village, and its children, wouldn't survive. The church loomed over every peasant village, in thought, in ritual, and often quite literally, since it usually had the only stone building and a bell loud enough to wake the fields. When it came to food, the church was both gatekeeper and paradox. On the one hand, it preached fasting, humility, and sacrifice. On the other, it held lands, collected tithes, and stored grain. Priests sometimes distributed alms, bread, fish, porridge, especially during holidays or times of widespread hunger. But not always. And not evenly. Sometimes that bread fell off the cart conveniently near the cottage of a starving family. Sometimes it didn't. There were rules about what could be eaten and when: no meat on Fridays, fasting before feast days. And for many, these rules were more about religious fear than culinary choice. You didn't want to be the one caught roasting a rabbit during Lent, because even if your soul wasn't damned, your neighbors might report you. Still, the church was part of the survival web. A generous priest could keep a dozen families afloat. A selfish one could cause quiet starvation. And nobody dared say so aloud. It's hard to explain how ever-present the church was in a medieval village without sounding like we're exaggerating. But it was truly everywhere. Not just the stone chapel on the hill, but the bells, the calendar, the fasts, the feasts, the whispered prayers before every meal, even when the meal was only warm water and hope. To be clear, religion wasn't a weekend affair. It structured time itself. The days were named for saints. The seasons were marked by sacred celebrations. And for a peasant family trying to survive the winter, that meant both obligation and the possibility of help. On certain feast days, it was customary for the church to distribute alms, little offerings of bread, porridge, or dried fish. If you were lucky. If the priest was feeling generous. If you'd attended Mass. If your children weren't too dirty or loud. If someone at the manor hadn't already taken it all. Sometimes, there was a surplus from the Lord's stores, or a shipment meant for the monastery that fell off the cart, so to speak. A slightly moldy cheese rind, or a crusty heel of bread wrapped in cloth. Word would spread quietly, passed from mother to mother, and women would shuffle to the back of the chapel with their heads low, not begging exactly, just hoping. And they'd return with whatever they were given. No questions, no complaints. Because even stale food blessed by silence was better than nothing. The church gave, but it also reminded you why you needed to be given to. Hunger was not just a hardship. It was a moral condition. A test of humility. A divine shaping of the soul. And the message, softly sewn into every sermon, was this: if your belly ached, perhaps God was asking you to kneel longer. If your children cried at night, maybe it was time for deeper faith. Of course, these were women who already knew how to pray. Who prayed constantly, while stirring pots, boiling cloths, mending boots. Who had no need to be reminded of sacrifice. But still, they received what they could. And sometimes, what arrived wasn't food at all. It was a moment of rest in the back pew. A quiet sigh beside a friend. A shared glance between mothers who understood what it meant to count grains of barley like coins. So, what do we take from this? In the end, feeding a family in 1347 wasn't just about food. It was about invention, endurance, and a kind of invisible intelligence that rarely made it into the history books. There were no grocery lists, no stocked pantries, no written recipes passed down on parchment. But there was knowledge, passed quietly, hand to hand, from one tired woman to another. A knowledge of how to stretch, to swap, to soften hardship into something almost edible. Scarcity was not a temporary phase. It was the background hum of life for centuries. And yet, people found ways to share, to adapt, to keep going. Barter became its own language. A wool sleeve could mean a warm meal. A whispered rumor might lead to an egg. A scrap of dried root became dinner when there was no dinner left. And behind it all was the emotional labor no one saw, the mental arithmetic of how much to serve and to whom, the quiet weighing of needs, the holding of fear behind a calm face, especially in front of little ones. These moments, so easily forgotten in grand historical narratives, are precisely what held communities together. Not kings, not castles. But the woman who chose to give her portion away, one more night. Today, we call it food insecurity. We call it economic anxiety. But the experience, at its core, hasn't changed much. Standing in your kitchen wondering what's for dinner, and how far you can make it go, is something millions still know intimately. The technology may be different. The menus may have expanded. But the questions remain painfully familiar: will it be enough? Who gets the last piece? And how do we hide our worry from the ones we love? If you're still listening, somewhere between waking and sleep, I hope this slow walk through the hunger months has brought you a little comfort, not because the past was easier, but because it reminds us that even in the hardest seasons, people found ways to survive. They found quiet ways to care for one another. And they did it without glory, without applause, and often without thanks. But we remember them now. In these stories. In this quiet space between the facts and the feelings. And that matters more than we think. If you enjoyed this journey, I'd love to know. What other corners of this strange, fascinating era are you curious about? Leave a comment when you wake, or whenever you're next looking for something soft to listen to. And if you'd like more slow, gentle stories like this one, you can always subscribe or follow the channel so you never miss our next quiet adventure. For now, rest well. Let the fire burn low. The pot is empty, but the story is full. Good night.